Mark had always cherished the rare moments when the house was his alone. In a life filled with constant noise, the hum of family activities, the clatter of dishes, the laughter of his two kids, Max and Sophie, those pockets of silence were precious. This time, however, the quiet felt different. His wife, Emma, had taken Max and Sophie on a long-awaited trip to the mountains, something she'd been planning for months. The kids were thrilled, and Emma was finally able to check off one of the many items on her personal bucket list, an escape into the serene landscapes of the mountains. For Mark, this left a void. He wasn't opposed to joining them. In fact, he had considered it. But the thought of uninterrupted hours, even days, to focus on work without the distraction of everyday life was a luxury he hadn't enjoyed in what felt like forever. He needed to catch up on emails, meetings, projects that had been steadily piling up. And so, he stayed behind, alone in their spacious house, surrounded by the stillness that seemed almost too peaceful at first. The silence felt like a breath he could finally take, but deep down, it made him realize how much he missed the chaos that came with his family's presence. The first night alone was like any other. Mark buried himself in his laptop, skimming through emails, attending virtual meetings, and ticking off to-do lists. The house was quiet, save for the soft tapping of keys and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. He found comfort in the routine, the predictable nature of it. Yet that evening, something tugged at him, a sudden feeling that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but a quiet, nagging awareness that he was alone, really alone. Just as he was about to wrap up for the night, he heard a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, but as he opened the door, he found his neighbor, Jerry, standing there, his face unusually animated, his eyes wide and intense. "Hey, Mark," Jerry greeted, his voice edged with urgency. "I've just installed security cameras around my place." Mark blinked, momentarily taken aback. Jerry, always a little jumpy, a little on edge when it came to safety, was now looking at him with the kind of serious expression Mark had never seen before. "Cameras? In this neighborhood?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing with confusion. "Yeah," Jerry replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "With everything going on these days, it's a good move. Better to be safe than sorry, right? I've got some friends who've had their homes broken into, even in neighborhoods like this. You can never be too careful." Mark raised an eyebrow, casting a skeptical glance at Jerry's rigid posture. The neighborhood was quiet, practically sleepy, in fact. Everyone knew everyone else. The idea of someone breaking into a house here felt like something out of a thriller movie, not a reality. But Jerry continued, detailing how his cameras had already given him peace of mind, how they provided him with a sense of control over the safety of his property. "Honestly, it's not just about the cameras themselves," Jerry continued, his voice dropping lower. "It's about being vigilant. You never know what's lurking out there." Mark listened, though he didn't feel the same sense of urgency. But the earnestness in Jerry's voice gave him pause. Maybe Jerry was right. Maybe there was some hidden danger lurking beneath the surface of their peaceful town, some threat they had yet to notice. Mark's mind raced, briefly considering the possibility of something unexpected happening while his family was away. The idea of leaving his home unprotected, even if it felt unnecessary, gnawed at him. What if something did happen? "I don't know." Mark hesitated, his mind swirling. It seemed a bit extreme, but I suppose it couldn't hurt. Jerry's face lit up with a grin that, despite his initial anxiety, made Mark feel like he'd made the right choice. Exactly. It's better to be prepared than caught off guard. The next day, Mark found himself sitting at his computer, researching security cameras. There was something strange about the urgency he felt, almost as if an invisible force had pushed him to make the decision, despite his reservations. Maybe it was the looming silence, the unsettling feeling of being alone in a house that was usually filled with the hum of family life. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the thought. The more he looked into it, the more convinced he became. A simple camera system, one that he could monitor right from his phone, wouldn't hurt. So, with a few clicks, he ordered the cameras, expecting them to arrive in a couple of days. He tried to convince himself that it was just a precaution, that it wasn't a reflection of fear or paranoia, just a simple, rational step to ensure the house was secure while his family was away. When the cameras arrived, Mark couldn't wait to get them set up. He spent the entire afternoon unpacking the boxes, reading through the instructions, and carefully positioning the cameras around the house. He made sure to cover all the entrances, the front door, the back patio, even the windows that he knew were rarely used but were still vulnerable. It felt oddly satisfying, the act of setting up something that could offer him some semblance of control over his environment. Each camera was meticulously adjusted, and after hours of work, Mark sat back, surveying his handiwork. Everything worked perfectly. He could see the feed from each camera on his phone, watch the small, blue lights blink as they recorded. He felt a flicker of relief, as though the weight of worry had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in days, Mark relaxed. He had done what needed to be done. The house was secure, and now nothing could threaten it. But as the evening settled in, a strange feeling crept over him. He hadn't told Emma about the cameras. She had left in such a rush, excited for the trip, and he hadn't thought to mention it. He should have. He realized she would have wanted to know. And yet, as he lay in bed that night, the soft hum of the cameras in the background, he convinced himself that it was fine. It wasn't a big deal. She'd be fine with it. After all, they were just cameras. But the nagging sense of unease remained. A part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something just out of reach, was waiting. Something was coming. The days felt long for Mark as he waited for his family's return. He had grown so used to the quiet, the empty house echoing with his own footsteps, that he hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of laughter, of voices filling the air. He hadn't realized how deeply the absence of his family had affected him until they were back. When Max and Sophie came running through the door, their voices, high-pitched with excitement, echoed in the hallways. Sophie had barely dropped her school bag before she started telling Mark about her day, her words tumbling over one another. Max, with his more laid-back style, had a grin that could light up the room. And then Emma, his Emma, came in behind them, the aroma of something delicious wafting from the kitchen, filling every corner of the house. It was like life had returned, like the house had been holding its breath, and now it was alive again. Mark hadn't realized how much he'd missed this, the hum of family life, the routine, the comforting chaos that came with being surrounded by loved ones. He had missed the feeling of having someone to share breakfast with, the small moments that threaded the hours together. Emma's gentle hums as she cooked, Sophie's excited chatter about her latest project, and Max's quiet observations about everything around him. It was all so normal, so familiar. The way they fit together in their little rhythms was something Mark hadn't appreciated until it was gone. Life fell back into its usual pattern. Max and Sophie went off to school in the mornings, their backpacks bouncing with every step. Mark and Emma would split their time between work and household chores, finding pockets of peace and laughter in between. Evenings, though, were the most cherished. After dinner, they'd all settle into the living room, sometimes to watch a movie, sometimes to sit on the porch, looking out over the yard, talking about their days and how much they'd missed each other while they'd been apart. Those moments, small, seemingly inconsequential, were treasures to Mark. His heart felt fuller each time they happened, as if he were rediscovering the love that had always been there. It was on one of those peaceful mornings, a Tuesday to be exact, that Mark's sense of contentment was disrupted. He had been sitting at his desk, sipping his coffee, scrolling through his work emails when something, a stray thought, really made him remember the security cameras he'd installed around the house. It had been a while since he'd checked the footage. Not that he expected anything strange. They had been installed as a precaution more than anything else, a way to give Emma peace of mind while she was home alone. But on a whim, Mark decided to open the app. As soon as he did, a chill ran down his spine. The footage before him showed a man entering his home. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He froze, staring at the screen, his mind racing. The timestamp showed the visit had occurred in the middle of the day, while Max and Sophie were at school. Emma was supposed to be at home, working just like she always did. But this wasn't a person he recognized. The man didn't seem in a hurry. His movements, though casual, felt deliberate as he walked through the rooms, almost like he belonged there. Mark's stomach twisted. He replayed the video. Maybe it was a delivery person. Maybe someone had come to fix something, though Emma hadn't mentioned it. Maybe it was someone who had been hired to do work on the house. But no, something about the man's presence, his comfort in moving through the house, felt wrong. There was a disconnect, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The more Mark watched, the more his unease grew. His mind began to race with questions. Who was this man? Why hadn't Emma mentioned anyone coming by? He tried to reason with himself, to tell himself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, a random occurrence. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The man seemed too at ease, too familiar in a house that wasn't his. There was no way it was just a coincidence. But Mark hesitated. Should he mention it to Emma? Should he bring it up and risk worrying her? Or worse, making her feel uncomfortable in their own home? No, he thought. It was probably nothing. He didn't want to make a big deal out of something that might turn out to be insignificant. Still, the thought lingered. Why would someone enter their home when they weren't expecting anyone? What was this man looking for? And most importantly, why did it feel like he knew something was off, even if he couldn't explain why? The unease grew inside him, eating away at his contentment. Mark couldn't stop thinking about it. The peace of his family's return was no longer enough to calm the storm of questions swirling in his mind. The house, once filled with the warmth of shared moments, now seemed strangely distant, as if there was something hidden beneath the surface, just out of reach. Something that had changed, something that might never feel quite the same again. The morning after, Mark sat alone in his study, his mind spinning. The footage from the cameras he'd installed the day before blinked across the screen, playing in a loop. Each frame seemed to settle deeper into his stomach, the unease mounting like a heavy, suffocating weight. He watched the footage again, scrutinizing the same figure that had become an unwelcome presence in their home. The man, the stranger. He was back. Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowing. The man moved through the house as though he had lived there his whole life. He knew the layout, the furniture, the rooms. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in his steps. He knew where to go, how to move. There was something disturbingly familiar about him. Something Mark couldn't put his finger on, but something that made his blood run cold. A sense of dread twisted in Mark's gut. It wasn't just that this man was here. It was how he carried himself, how he moved through their home with a sense of ownership. He wasn't there to fix a leaky faucet or check on the plumbing. No, this was different. This man was someone who belonged in the house. But Mark didn't know him. He had to know more. His stomach churned as he closed the footage, his hand hovering over the mouse. The decision gnawed at him, but he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't live with this unknown, this creeping suspicion. That night, when the house was quiet and Emma was already in bed, Mark moved quickly, setting up additional cameras. One in the living room, another in the bedroom where the man had appeared before. He didn't tell Emma. He couldn't. There was a strange, primal instinct within him, telling him that he needed to uncover the truth on his own, to confront it alone, even if it shattered everything. Days passed in a haze. Mark tried his best to maintain normalcy. He went about his daily routine, spoke with Emma about trivial things, laughed when he had to, and smiled when required. But inside, there was a storm brewing. Every moment felt heavy with the knowledge that something was wrong, that something was hidden just out of sight behind the walls of their home. The cameras became his obsession. Each time he passed them, he felt an inexplicable urgency to check the footage, to uncover something, anything, that would make sense of the growing anxiety that consumed him. Then came the night. A week later, when Mark finally couldn't put it off any longer, he sat at his desk, his fingers trembling as he clicked through the footage. The first part of the video was mundane, no surprises there. But when he reached the morning recordings, his entire world seemed to stop. His heart thundered in his chest. The footage showed his bedroom, the room that was supposed to be the sanctuary of his life with Emma. But there on the screen was the man. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The man was in the bed with Emma. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. He blinked, trying to make sense of it. But the image didn't change. It didn't go away. Emma, the woman he loved, his partner, was lying there beside this stranger, her body turned toward him, their faces close. She was smiling, the kind of smile Mark had once believed was reserved only for him. The man was touching her, his hands tracing the familiar lines of her skin as if they had known each other forever. Mark's hands trembled violently as he watched the scene unfold, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. A cold sweat broke out on his brow, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. His mind raced, filled with disbelief, anger, and a crushing sorrow. It was all real. Every single moment, every fleeting touch, this wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't some twisted trick of his mind. His wife, the woman who had vowed to spend her life with him, was betraying him. She was with someone else, in their bed, in his life. The pain hit him like a physical blow, a deep, gnawing ache that spread through every inch of his being. It was a pain he hadn't expected, couldn't have prepared for. Betrayal, he had always believed, was something that happened to other people, to people whose marriages were already broken, already lost. But this was his reality now. He had watched it unfold before his very eyes. The intimacy, the trust that had been shattered in an instant. Mark's body went numb as the full weight of the truth settled over him. He sat there, motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen as if somehow, if he stared long enough, it might disappear. But it didn't. The image remained. His mind screamed for action, for confrontation, for answers. But in that moment, he realized that the truth was more than just the betrayal he had seen. It was something deeper, something darker. His world was unraveling, piece by piece. And the most painful part of it all was that he didn't even know who his wife really was anymore. The world around Mark seemed to collapse in an instant. It was as though everything he had ever known, everything he had worked for, was crumbling beneath him. His chest tightened with an unrelenting ache as the truth, ugly and raw, flooded his mind. The betrayal was no longer a whisper in the back of his head. It was an undeniable reality, and it hit him with the force of a storm. Emma, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had shattered that trust in the most brutal way. The images on his phone burned in his hands, a painful reminder of a life he had once shared with her. He felt a sickening mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief, each emotion fighting for dominance within him. Mark had known there was something off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had ignored the whispers, the late nights, the evasive glances. But this was undeniable. His mind raced with thoughts of what had brought them to this moment. He couldn't ignore the evidence any longer. His relationship with Emma, what he thought was a bond of love and loyalty, had been nothing more than a facade. The woman who had once been his everything had betrayed him in the most intimate way. It was time to confront her. There was no running away from this. He had to face the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The afternoon passed in a blur as Mark stood in the living room, waiting. Max and Sophie had left for school, their innocent laughter still ringing in his ears as they walked out the door. Mark remained frozen, his eyes glued to the phone in his hand, waiting for Emma to come home. When she finally entered, her smile faltered as she noticed the cold silence in the room. She stopped in her tracks, her gaze falling on Mark, who was standing with the phone in his hand, his face pale and devoid of emotion. "What's going on, Mark?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. But Mark didn't answer. Instead, he wordlessly held up the phone, showing her the damning footage that would change everything. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the image on the screen, and in that moment, Mark could see every ounce of color drain from her face. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting between him and the phone. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Then, a soft gasp escaped her, followed by a strangled sob. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating even. Mark could hardly breathe as he watched Emma's face shift from shock to shame, then to something far worse, despair. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, her body breaking down with sobs as the weight of what she had done became too much to bear. "I'm so sorry, Mark," she cried, her voice cracking. "It was a mistake. It meant nothing. I swear. Please forgive me." Her hands were shaking as she clung to him, begging him to understand, to find a way to forgive her. But Mark couldn't respond. His chest was tight, his heart pounding in his ears, and the words simply wouldn't come. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rage at her for what she had done, for the destruction she had brought into their lives. But instead, he stood there, paralyzed, the pain searing through him. The trust they had built, what he had believed to be a solid foundation, was gone, reduced to dust. The love he had given so freely now felt like a lie. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out as a whisper, low and firm. "I can't do this, Emma." His voice didn't waver. There was no anger, no shouts, just an undeniable truth. "There's no going back." Emma collapsed to the floor, her sobs racking her body, her face buried in her hands. Mark couldn't watch it anymore. He couldn't bear to see her in pain, but he couldn't let her undo the hurt she had caused, either. He turned away, walking towards the door, each step feeling like a lifetime. The life they had built together, those years of shared moments, of trust, of love, was shattered beyond repair. The days that followed were a blur. The house felt empty, like a shell of what it used to be. Emma tried to explain herself, tried to make him see that it had been a mistake, that it had meant nothing. But Mark remained silent. His mind was made up. Divorce was inevitable. There was no fixing what had been broken. But in the midst of his heartache, Mark discovered something that would fuel his desire for justice. Through a network of friends and acquaintances, he learned the name of the man who had stolen everything from him. The man who had not only betrayed Mark's trust, but had invaded his most personal space. The man was Alex Turner, a respected therapist in town, someone Mark had trusted and never suspected. Mark felt a bitter sense of vindication when he uncovered Alex's identity. The therapist had not only crossed a professional boundary, he had destroyed a family, a life. With the footage in his possession, Mark knew what he had to do. The truth needed to be exposed, and he would be the one to do it. With determination, Mark shared the video with the world. The footage went viral, and the scandal spread like wildfire. Alex Turner's carefully constructed life began to crumble. Patients canceled their appointments in droves, his clinic quickly dismissed him, and his wife, no longer able to trust him, left him, taking their children with her. As Mark watched Alex's life fall apart, he felt an odd mix of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but the cost was still high. He had exposed the truth, but it hadn't healed the wound in his heart. The pain of betrayal would linger long after the scandal had faded from the public's mind. Mark knew, deep down, that there was no going back. He had done what he needed to do. The truth had been revealed, and Alex, once seen as a man of integrity, now faced the consequences of his actions. Mark didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel like a hero. He just felt empty. In the end, there was nothing left to salvage.